Okay, I really do not want to put this episode this low, but this is season 4 or season 6, episode 4. Here's Not Here. I think this episode, in terms of storytelling and artistic abilities and stuff like that, it is a beautiful episode. A lot about it, the symbolism behind it, the overall dialogue behind it, that is all just amazing. But it does not deny the fact that this episode could be seen as boring. And honestly, in my opinion, when I'm not even gonna lie to you guys, I was kind of bored the first time watching it. Obviously, as you watch it more and more and more, you get to understand. After seeing Morgan develop as a character, I would say through season 7 and season 8, it makes you care about this episode more. It makes this episode more important. But definitely at the time, I was bored out of my mind. Maybe because I didn't like Morgan that much at that time. Now he's one of my favorite characters, but at the time, I didn't really care too much about him. Looking back on it, it was an important episode. I think I put this episode like my top 10 worst at the time. But obviously, after seeing Morgan develop, it obviously moved up in the list. But it still doesn't take away from the fact that I wouldn't want to watch this episode a million times over and over. You know what I mean? It's not that great, but the storytelling behind it and the dialogue and the development of Morgan is great. But it's just one character being developed. One episode for one character kind of sounds like, you don't need a whole episode for one character. Obviously, Morgan's an important character. We know that. He's a freaking crossover to Fear the Walking Dead. But it just feels like we didn't need a whole episode for it. Maybe it could have been spanned over a couple episodes or something like that, and sprinkled in a little bit. Obviously, I felt like it was still an important episode to do for Morgan's sake, but, doesn't make it a great episode by any means. It makes it a pretty good one. Next up, we have Season 8, Episode 11, Dead or Alive Or. This episode was, at the time, I thought it was okay. A lot of people complain about this episode more than I expected, but at the time, it wasn't that great. Then moving on later towards Season 8, I thought it was a little bit better, but it still doesn't make it an amazing episode by any means. It had some pretty interesting development with Tara and Dwight. I still think Tara is just stupid for doing that. I didn't feel like it was out of her character. I felt like it was definitely part of her character to act like that, but at the same time, it felt frustrating just to see Tara do that to Dwight, and it also felt slow in certain portions. The swamp stuff was like, alright, we don't really need this, and some of the other stuff with Negan at the end was great though. I really enjoyed that. And the Father Gabriel and Dr. Carson stuff felt really unnecessary, to be completely honest, because they just killed off Dr. Carson in a dumb way, I felt like. But overall, decent episode, not great. Next up, we have Season 5, Episode 7, Crossed. This is definitely one of my favorite episodes during the hospital story arc, which was one of my least favorite story arcs in The Walking Dead history. But I did enjoy this episode for a few different scenes in particular. I enjoyed, first of all, Rick with the long-ass beard looked amazing in this episode. And I enjoyed the one scene where they were attacking the hospital people. They're trying to, take them captive. And then, they saw all those really cool rotted-up walkers. That was cool. And then Daryl fought the one dude and murked him in the head with the walker head. That was awesome. But the rest of it, some of the hospital stuff, some of the stuff back with Father Gabriel, I didn't really care too much about. But so it's an okay episode. Not amazing or anything, but it was okay. Next up, we have Season 6, Episode 5, Now. And I actually really enjoyed this episode. A lot of people called it filler, trash, they called it boring. But I love the dialogue in this episode. I love the character development between characters like Jesse, Maggie, Aaron, even some Rick stuff. We had some great development in this episode. Tara, I forgot about Tara and Denise. They had some great stuff going on too. And people just really like to bash this episode. I feel the same way about the next episode on the list, but it's a very underrated episode. I feel like I felt like, especially the beginning. The beginning was amazing when Rick was running and there was the walkers. And he's like, "Open the gate now!" I love that. Overall, good episode. And we revealed Maggie was pregnant this episode. That was great too. That was emotional. So I thought it was a good one. Next up, we have one of the most hated episodes in The Walking Dead history, which is Season 7, Episode 6, Swear. I really don't understand why people hate this episode so much. Even if you hated Tara, it still had some interesting stuff going on. It was the introduction of Oceanside, which ended up being not really that important, but somewhat important for Season 8, and it will definitely be important for Season 9 and ahead. It was important for, I would say, Tara, Enid, and Aaron's development in some ways. So I enjoyed this episode. I feel a lot of people give it a lot of flack because it feels like a filler. It feels like a bottle, which it is a bottle, but it's not a filler, really. A lot of people compare it to Slabtown, but the reason why I feel like it's so different is Slabtown, because Slabtown, we had Beth being killed off within a few episodes later, and we had the whole hospital group being, just gone for the next few episodes afterwards. So it felt like Slabtown was worthless, because it was the introduction of the hospital as well as Beth development. But this episode was development for Tara, who survived for a long time, and development of a new community, which survived for a long time too, and is still around to this day. So definitely going to be more important later on in the show as well. So people got to realize that. Next up, coming in at number 70, we have Season 6, Episode 10, The Next World. This episode was a really funny, fun type of episode that happened after an insane season or mid-season premiere, which was, of course, No Way Out, which will be way higher on the list, trust me. And this episode was a good way to kind of bring back the feel of just comedy to the show, bring back some of the older, because they've had a lot of comedy in The Walking Dead in the earlier seasons, like season 2, a little bit in season 1 even, but they brought it back in this episode, and I actually kind of enjoy. They did have it throughout the season, sprinkled in here and there, but this episode was a full-on, just fun comedic episode with some romance in there, of course with Rick and Michonne at the end. So it made for an interesting and enjoyable episode, but it doesn't make it, an incredible episode in terms of writing or anything like that. But it had good performances. They made it, the comedic feel, fit The Walking Dead in a very meaningful way. Next up, we have Season 5, Episode 10, Them. This episode gets a lot of flack for being kind of slow, and people call it filler. But in terms of character development, this episode is actually very important to the plot, very important to the story of characters specifically, as Daryl, Maggie, Sasha, even Father Gabriel, and Noah. It's really, really character development for all these characters, and a lot of people don't really think about that. And the scene when they were in the barn and there was a storm, and they were all working together and pushing against the barn door to keep the walkers out, people don't think about it, but that was actually a really good, it was amazingly written. Just the way how everyone was broken at the beginning of the episode, they were all apart, and then they all came together, and then the sign of hope came at the end, of course Aaron being the sign of hope for Alexandria, as where they end up going in 2 episodes later. Next up, we have Season 7, Episode 12, Say Yes. This episode gets a ton of flack for feeling like a fillerish episode, as well as the infamous CGI deer. But the fact that people are able to call an episode terrible because of a CGI deer is pathetic. The CGI deer does not take me to the point where I'm like, alright, this episode is terrible. No, that's not how it works. Of course, CGI deer was just kind of stupid. I don't know why they decided to do that or why they couldn't do anything better than that. But, look, I don't care. In terms of an episode, it's a fun, just like the last one, or not the last one, The Next World. It feels like a fun, comedic, enjoyable episode that also includes some deep character building between Rick and Michonne that is so much needed for the death of Carl in Season 8. This episode built up his death in such a meaningful way. And if they actually decide to have Rick leave the show, or if Rick decides to leave the show, Andrew Lincoln decides to leave, this episode would be actually very impactful for that as well. Next up, we have Season 7, Episode 13, Bury Me Here. The episode actually after Say Yes, so it's interesting how that kind of worked that way. But this episode was a complete and utter Morgan episode, as well as a little bit of Carol and Ezekiel, but primarily was Morgan. And seeing Morgan go back into clear mode was the greatest thing, one of the greatest things of this season, because, honestly, I was getting sick of Morgan. I was like, you know what? He's too much of this all life is precious stuff. He's getting too much into it. It fit his character, but I was like, he's getting way too much into it. You'd think, he'd be alright with at least a little bit of killing, and him going back into clear mode was very entertaining to watch, even though he was a little too crazy. And obviously in Season 8 he gets even more crazy, and just seeing Morgan develop as a character through the 2 different extremes of either no killing or killing everyone basically was very interesting to watch. And this is kind of the start of the back and forth of it that he went through out in Season 8. So good episode in my opinion. I didn't think the death of Richard was necessary, but obviously the death of Benjamin was very necessary. Next up, we have Season 2, Episode 9, Triggerfinger. This episode was the first episode that we had human versus human kind of like conflict between each other, like action, like actual action between two different groups of people, which we never really saw before this. You know, we saw a little bit of it, but it wasn't actual, like it wasn't like a shootout type of a deal. This was the first time we actually saw like a shootout between two groups that ended in a lot of death between, obviously, the other group. You know, the group themselves didn't actually, you know, get too hurt, but all that was just incredible. It was amazing to watch. It was very entertaining to watch, and personally makes it one of my best one of my favorite episodes in Season 2, I have to say. I think it started the whole action part of The Walking Dead, because, you know, before this, Season 1, a little bit in Season 2, wasn't all that action-packed, but this episode started to bring some action to it, and I think for the better, because honestly, action is one of the best parts of the show. It's entertaining to watch, right? Next, we have Season 6, Episode 14, Twice as Far. This is one of those episodes where the first 30 minutes is honestly pretty terrible, and if it ended there, it would be like a really just not that good episode. But the last 10 minutes of the episode, pretty freaking awesome to watch. Right from the start of Denise getting the arrow through the eye, which was just like Abraham's death from the comic, was incredible. I thought it was done perfectly during her conversation. She was still speaking after it. It was so awesome to watch. And then you have, you know, Dwight coming up and being, you know, the reveal of Dwight. You know, he's alive, and he's also a part of the Saviors, which was really confusing for non-comic book readers, but for comic book readers, we understood what was going on. And then, of course, Eugene butting his dick. Great stuff. I loved it. But the beginning, you know, kind of brings the episode down a little bit because it was very, very slow. I mean, there really wasn't much to bring. I mean, he had some interesting development with Abraham and Eugene, but the Denise stuff was just going on and on and on, and they killed her off anyways, so it was like, alright, what was the point of all that? But for Daryl and Rosita, I guess there wasn't much there, but the action at the end of the episode was definitely the best part, and some of the Abraham-Eugene conversations were also pretty great as well. Next up, we have Season 7, Episode 9, Rock in the Road. This episode was very, very awesome in terms of bringing all the communities together in the rise up against Negan. It was the start of the whole rise up motto, whatever you call it. And I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed the meeting with Ezekiel. I really enjoyed the whole highway stuff. That was an intense sequence when they were getting all the bombs off the wire, and then they were collecting them, and then they used the wire to just mow down like a shit ton of walkers. That was really awesome to watch. And then, of course, you get them returning to Alexandria, and Simon being there and being like, where the fuck's Daryl? And really great stuff from this episode. It was a very, very different pacing. You know, people were mad about all the bottle episodes in the first half, and then this episode was just a full-on mashup of a bunch of different story arcs going on, which was great to see. And personally, I loved it. Next up, we have Season 5, Episode 13, Forget. This episode was another developing episode of the Alexandria community, but it was a very different type of episode because we could see the characters doubting the community. We get to see the characters being like, all right, these people may not be all that great. They may be dangerous, so we need to, you know, look out. And then Rick was like, all right, you know, Rick, Carol, Daryl were all talking about getting a gun, but then Daryl got all this, you know, close with Aaron, and so he was thinking, you know, maybe this community's not as bad as it seems, and everyone else was getting close, and Sasha was going crazy because she's not used to this type of stuff, and a lot of the characters were just getting kind of asserted into this community. It was kind of happening in episode 12, but this was kind of like the part 2 of it, so it was good, not amazing or anything. There wasn't any insane things going on, but I enjoyed it. And then they had a pretty nice song at the end, and Rick putting his hand on the wall. I love that scene, but yeah, good episode, but not amazing. Next up, we have Season 8, Episode 7, Time for After. This episode was interesting. I really wanted to see a cooler looking like Winslow Walker in this episode, because I thought we were going to have a second Winslow, and we did, which was awesome, but I wish there was a cooler Winslow, maybe a more dangerous one than before, instead of Rick killing it that easily. And but we also had some other cool stuff in this episode. It was mainly Dwight Eugene oriented at the sanctuary, and you know, I enjoy the stuff with Dwight. I didn't really enjoy stuff with Eugene too much, but I got used to it after a while and ended up actually kind of being, you know, okay with it and understanding where Eugene's coming from, and therefore actually enjoying this episode more than I saw a lot of people, because a lot of people actually complained a lot about this episode, and I could see why you might have complained about it, because yeah, there were some parts that were like kind of slow and boring, and personally it was the Father Gabriel and Eugene conversations in the beginning of the episode. I was like, alright, this is going on for too long. And but there was some other great stuff that was involved with also the Daryl going through with the plan of driving the big truck into the wall, and then it succeeded, and kind of succeeded, and the walkers flew in, and you saw Regina taking charge, and that was good stuff. But other than that, it was an okay episode. Okay, next up is Season 3, Episode 16, Welcome to the Tombs. We are finally getting into the episodes I consider above average, like on a 0 out of 10 types, out of 10, rating system. I would say every episode from now on, I would say it's like a 7 out of 10 at least. So we're getting into the good episodes that I think are just really good, and obviously we're going to get to the amazing and the masterpieces later on as well. This episode was a disappointing one at first. Like, when it first came out, it was insanely disappointing because we were expecting some big final climax and we didn't get that. But after seeing Season 4 and stuff like that, and you look back at this episode, it was actually pretty well done, and I actually kind of enjoyed it more than people kind of act like they do. I thought the Andrea death was done perfectly. I thought the ending sequence was amazing. I thought the whole message behind the episode was really, really well done. How you can take in people you can take in enemies and you can become friends with them, which I thought was really awesome to see. It's kind of similar to what we're seeing in Season 8. And Governor just going ham and just killing all his people was really fucking menacing to watch. It made the Governor a scary motherfucker, which is exactly how he should be. So I'm really happy that they did that. That scene. That was really awesome. And then you had some other stuff with Tyrese and Sasha and whatever. It was interesting. Okay episode, not a good finale though. Next up, we have Season 6, Episode 13, The Same Boat. Obviously, very clearly a bottle episode, but it was a good bottle episode. It was really, really good for Maggie and Carol's development as characters, and I really did enjoy it for that, but it did feel like it was dragging on at the beginning. But the last 10 minutes, just like some other episodes I was saying that are really good in the last 10 minutes, man, it was amazing. I mean, just seeing Maggie just beat that one girl's face in with the gun was just awesome to see. And then we see Carol make some really stupid decisions, but it made sense for her character to make dumb decisions, I guess. And then you have Maggie fighting that one girl, and then Carol just comes up right in the head. That was great. Just seeing Carol change as a character in this episode, not really playing a part anymore, she's actually becoming the part she's played for the past year, was really entertaining to watch, and I love that. Next up, we have Season 4, Episode 13, which is titled Alone. This episode was pretty great. It had a lot of interesting story arcs going on. It had Sasha, Maggie, and Bob going off on their own, kind of developing as characters and deciding what the hell they should do. Should they go for Glenn? Should they go for Terminus? Where the hell they should go? What the hell they should do? Entertaining as hell to watch, but that wasn't the good part of the episode. I thought the good parts were Daryl and Beth, actually. I thought they had an interesting bond in Episode 12, but this episode just explored upon their bond in such a better and in-depth way that I just fucking loved. I loved every second of them together in this episode. Not as a couple, obviously. I thought of them as like a friends type of thing, or maybe even a brother-sister relationship, almost, sort of. But I really, really did enjoy it, and definitely made the Carol fans, the Daryl/Carol fans, those people who ship them, it made them mad. But it was just a very entertaining episode to watch in terms of that. And then you see, of course, Beth getting taken at the end of the episode, which is also really cool. And that's basically all I saw in the episode, but it did make for a decently entertaining episode, not above, beyond entertaining, but normal. Next up, we have Season 6, Episode 7, Heads Up. This episode was when they showed Glenn coming out, and not coming out like being gay, but coming out in terms of the fact that he was alive. We all thought he was dead, and I kind of liked how they did that. I kind of didn't at the same time, but I thought the way they revealed him coming back was definitely well done, and made for an interesting episode in terms of Glenn and Enid's development. Also, a lot of Maggie stuff going on, a lot of Spencer stuff too. Damn, Spencer was being a dick in this episode. But it was a very kind of calm before the storm type episode, especially the last 10 minutes where all this pumped up music and you were just like, what's about to happen? freaking whole the tower comes down, boom, walkers flood in. Made for a good episode. It's not incredible, but still pretty good. Next up, we have Season 2, Episode 10, 18 Miles Out. This is the episode with Rick and Shane going out on their own to bring Randall and just let him off in the open. And Shane decides, well, he probably knows where we are since he knows who Maggie is, so let's just kill him. And then Rick and Shane go at it for the first time, and man, oh man, was it amazing to watch. I love the Rick versus Shane stuff in the end of Season 2, even throughout the entirety of Season 2. It started back in like the first few episodes of Season 2, to be honest. And I freaking loved it, especially in this episode. Very awesome to watch. I mean, seeing two friends go at it was more entertaining than you'd think, honestly. That was really the only good parts of the episode. There was also Beth trying to kill herself, which I don't really care about, but the stuff with their Rick and Shane was top notch. Next up, we have Season 1, Episode 1, the first episode, Days Gone By. I know a lot of people are going to hate me. They're going to be like, oh, this episode should be number 1. It should be in the top 10. It should be in the top 20. But I'm not going to say it's the best episode or one of the best just because it's the first. Just because the first doesn't automatically make it the best. I think I'm a fond believer of that. That doesn't mean that some series may not have good first episodes. I think, for example, Breaking Bad, the first episode, is one of the best episodes of the entire series. But in my opinion, The Walking Dead, it was a great episode, but it wasn't as good as the rest. Trust me, the rest on this list I believe are all better. But it still was very, very awesome to see Rick wake up in the apocalypse and be freaking out over the loss of his, or not the loss, but the fact that he doesn't know what the hell's going on. And it was really entertaining to watch from perspective of someone who doesn't know what this world is about. Even though we do know that zombies are a thing, we know zombies based off of other movies and other shows, and Rick obviously doesn't. So he was confused, and that was really awesome to watch. And then the ending with the big ass herd was definitely a good way to start the series. Next up, we have Season 6, Episode 11, Knots Untied. This is the start of the Hilltop, the introduction of the Hilltop. And man, oh man, I fucking love the introduction to the Hilltop. I thought they had one of the best introductions of any community in the entire series, because we just saw Alexandria for a whole season, and we were, people were starting to get bored of it, stuff like that. We didn't really know there's going to be more communities out there. At least non-comic book fans didn't know. I knew, of course, but if you obviously didn't read the comics, you wouldn't really know that there's other communities out there. And then the introduction to the Hilltop, I thought, was one of the best introductions of any of the communities in this entire show. And we got introduction of what was going on with Negan. We didn't obviously see Negan, we just heard about him and got more, clarification on who he is. And it really set up the rest of Season 6, the entirety of Season 7, and honestly the entirety of Season 8. This episode set it all up. It set up the war. It set up Negan. It set up everything. So as a setup episode, this episode was amazing. Next up, we have Season 8, Episode 5, The Big Scary You. This was an awesome episode to see the villain side of things. We saw the first few episodes of the war, and we saw the heroes, fighting people. We didn't get to see the villains. We didn't get to see what the hell was going on at the Sanctuary after Episode 1. And this episode was just all about that. And then we also had a little bit of Rick and Daryl with their little fight, which was pretty cool to see. But overall, it was a very enclosed episode in Negan, Gabriel, Simon, Dwight, Eugene, Regina, all those characters, and I loved that. I liked seeing what was going on there, and it had really clarifications on a lot of different things, like, why they didn't bring out their whole entire Savior gang in Episode 1, and it clarified a lot of things for some people, and I liked that. Definitely did a lot. But some of the scenes did seem choppy. I didn't like how they didn't show Negan and Father Gabriel getting out of that situation. I'm still wondering how the fuck did they get out of that situation when the walkers literally fell on them, but I digress. Next up, we have Season 1, Episode 2, Guts, what I believe is the best episode of Season 1, and in my opinion, Season 1 is probably one of the worst seasons of the entire series, but it's not the show's fault. It's the first season. It's obviously not going to be all that amazing, but this episode was probably the best out of all of them. And it just had a lot of intense scenes, especially when they were going out into the walker horde with the guts on them after realizing that the scent, if you mask your scent, you will be able to do it. And I really enjoyed seeing that. I really enjoyed just the fear that these characters had against these walkers, because they don't know much about them. I mean, now in Season 8, they're not really afraid of them anymore, or as much as they were. But this episode, they were pissing themselves seeing it. I mean, Glenn puked when they cut up the one, because it was fearful, it was scary. They didn't know it yet. They didn't know everything about it yet. And then the rain came down. That was awesome. A lot of this episode was really cool. Seeing Atlanta, seeing the scenery in Atlanta was really awesome to see, and definitely got a lot of people into, after episode 1, people might have been like, all right, it's a good show, I'll continue to see how episode 2 is. But I think episode 2 is the episode that like signified the fact that this episode is going to be, or this show is going to be a good show. Next up, we have Season 5, Episode 8, Coda. In my opinion, a disappointing mid-season finale, but still a very, very good episode. I liked the stuff between the hospital. Even though I didn't like the story arc itself, I did like the way they ended it. Instead of it being like, I expected them to kind of just shoehorn action in, and this is the only time where I feel like not having action is actually a good thing, because they could have just had it so the two groups went against each other in a big shootout, which would have been awesome to see it from an entertainment standpoint, but from a story standpoint, it wouldn't make sense. And I felt like giving us a villainous group that didn't end in bloodshed, complete bloodshed, would have actually been good. And the way they killed off Beth, although it was really, really weird and strange, and a lot of people just didn't like it, and personally I thought it could have been done better, but I still thought it was really impactful. Just the fact that it was shocking. It was obviously she did it to save Noah, and clearly it worked, and made for a very emotional last 5 minutes of the episode, in my opinion. So the rest of the episode was okay, but I think the emotion behind her death was so impactful that it honestly made this episode way better than it would have been if she didn't die. Next, we have Season 5, Episode 12, Remember, the introduction of Alexandria episode, which I thought they introduced the community in a very, very good way, and honestly made for a kind of slow but very, very informational episode, and it really started the new era of The Walking Dead. It really did start a whole brand new sort of, I would just call it era of The Walking Dead. It was a new era, it was a new portion. We had, of course, on the road for a whole season and a half, honestly, and then we get to this, which was very, very good. It was a very new feeling of The Walking Dead, which I really enjoyed. Next up, we have Season 4, Episode 2, titled Infected. This is the 50th episode on this list. This is number 50, so we have 50 more to go, so hang in there. Infected was a really, really awesome episode. I really like this whole story arc of the sickness in the prison at the beginning of Season 4. It's a very underrated story arc in The Walking Dead. It's, an original story arc that was not in the comics. Therefore, I really did enjoy it. And because it was something new that we'd never seen before. I didn't know the outcome of the story. I didn't know how long it would last. I didn't know how, what would happen. I didn't know any about that. And this episode is where that sickness story started to develop and actually become something important. People, were turning overnight. They were eating each other, and it was a scary, frightening, and therefore very enjoyable episode that really is underlooked in my opinion. Next up, we have Season 3, Episode 12, Clear. This is the Return of Morgan episode, which I really did enjoy thoroughly, but of course, it's not going to be anywhere near the top, 10 or 20, even though a lot of people do say this is, their favorite episode. This is definitely a fan favorite from the community, and I agree. For a Morgan episode, it's one of his best episodes. I would honestly say it's probably Morgan's best episode ever, even better than Here's Not Here for Morgan, but I think the enjoyment of this episode, in my opinion, primarily came from Michonne and Carl's relationship developing. I loved Michonne in Season 3. I mean, I still do now, but, I really liked how her character was kind of this outcast, and then Carl was slowly kind of bringing her out of her shell, kind of, and I loved that whole entire thing. And then Rick ended up actually, dating her, and now they're basically lovers in Season 8, so I think this is kind of the start of that, and I thought it was really awesome seeing those characters talk. And then Morgan, just Lenny James's acting is just phenomenal in this episode, I have to say. Next up, we have Season 3, Episode 10, Home. This is another one of those episodes where, honestly, the last 10 minutes are, incredible, but the rest of it's kind of meh. But, once Axel gets shot in the head out of absolutely nowhere, first of all, that was one of the biggest shocks in the entire Walking Dead series. It was one of the biggest, holy shit moments. Even though Axel wasn't that big of a character, it was still a holy shit moment. Just seeing him get popped, and then basically the first major, actually a second major battle from the governor versus the prison group commencing, and it was very entertaining to watch, I have to say. I also liked a lot of the Daryl and Merle stuff, especially. We learned more about their past, the fact that their parents were kind of abusive, and he was, and Daryl was. They were bonding by saying, Merle didn't know that their dad also beat Daryl, not just himself. So that was interesting to see, and just the different conversations between them were very great. But the episode was not as good as it could have been, because he did have some slow stuff, like Rick going crazy still and just being off on his own, looking off into the distance and not knowing what to do. But overall, still a pretty good episode. Next up, we have Season 8, Episode 15, Worth. Some parts of this episode I really loved. Some parts of episodes were okay and not that great. I loved the beginning and the end of this episode. Hearing Carl's letter in the very beginning was one of the best scenes in the entire Walking Dead history. It was very emotional. It was very just impactful, and I loved his letter. I loved Rick's facial expressions during the letter. And then, of course, the ending with Michonne reading Negan's letter, or Carl's letter to Negan, out loud to Negan on walkie. That was amazing. But some other stuff, like Aaron trying to get Oceanside back. The Simon stuff was great. I loved everything with the Simon at the sanctuary. Negan, the intense nature of Negan. We didn't know if Negan knew about Dwight, but what about Simon? We didn't know if he was going to kill Simon, or if he's going to kill Dwight, or if he's going to do something. We had no idea. And seeing the tension rising and rising and rising, this episode was very entertaining, and it made for a pretty good episode. Next up, we have Season 7, Episode 10, New Best Friends. Honestly, this episode, I honestly have to say that I think it is this high because of the Winslow Walker. If there was no Winslow Walker in this episode, it would still be pretty high, but it would be probably 10 episodes further down. The Winslow Walker is one of the coolest additions to this show ever, and it was just in one episode. I mean, obviously they had a 2.0 version later on, which we talked about already, but there was something about it, man, because I'm a big fan of walkers being the main threat in this series. I like having other groups being threats, but it's, always down to the walkers, I feel like. And seeing them not being as threatful in later seasons kind of makes it it takes away the point of the apocalypse. And I want to see walkers be more threatful. And you can't really do that, because once you get used to them, what are you going to do? More herds? Just bigger and bigger herds? But this episode decided to, fiddle with the idea of I guess you can call it modified walkers, and this is the first modified walker we saw, and honestly, we've seen others, like the ones in Riot Gear and stuff like that. I guess you can call those modified walkers, but this one is like the first extreme modified walker, and I fucking loved it. I loved it, and I want to see more of these type of things, and I really hope we get to see something like this in the future. Maybe like a herd of these things. How awesome would that be? I don't know. I really like that. We also had other cool stuff with Carol, seeing Daryl again for the first time in a while. That was great. The introduction of the junkyard people in general was interesting. It wasn't, people, obviously a lot of people didn't like it, but personally I thought it was interesting. I was entertained by them, and the Winslow Walker made me kind of like the group a little bit, so, that's a good thing. Next up, we have Season 3, Episode 2, Sick. This episode was, I think, I would say the start of Rick Grimes' actions of a true madman, and he was kind of like that throughout Season 3, a little bit in 5, and this is kind of like the start of it. I mean, I guess, no, the start of it was at the Season 2 finale, but this was when he first made a decision that we have never seen Rick make before. I mean, he obviously defended himself by killing those two in the bar, but those two, they were drawing on him. They were already started to draw on him. But this guy, although he did try to kill him, Rick Grimes just sliced the dude's head in half with the machete. I mean, that is not just, that's different than just shooting a man. Completely different. So, in my opinion, this episode was the start of that, and I really enjoyed a lot of the stuff about this. Just the overall feeling of the prison. I mean, obviously it wasn't the introduction of the prison. Last episode was, but just seeing everything go down in terms of the prisoners still being there and being confused about what this new world is, and just everything that happened after that. The fact that Rick doesn't trust these people. You can't trust these people. I mean, the fact that Rick was a cop makes so much more sense too, why he doesn't trust them. I mean, they're prisoners. You can't really trust them. And then shit goes down basically, and that made for a pretty entertaining episode, I have to say. Next up, we have Season 8, Episode 4, Some Guy. This episode was the big kind of reveal afterwards, after the shooting of all the Kingdomers from the MG turret, and we see Ezekiel in a place of complete and utter just defeat. It's just him left. He's the only one left. Obviously, Carol and Jerry were off in the area, but they weren't, where he was from the people that were close to the MG shooting. He was the only one to survive, and it was very impactful for Ezekiel. This was a huge Ezekiel episode, and we also had some badass Carol killing, which was great, some badass Jerry stuff, and then of course the car chase scene at the end of the episode with Rick and Daryl hunting down those guys. I like the episode in terms of a lot of the writing and dialogue and such, but some of the action and directing and overall cinematography and choreography I didn't like in this episode. I don't know what it was. I just like the car chase scene. I wasn't a fan of how they did it. The whole shootout with Carol versus some of it I just didn't like. So something about it, but in terms of dialogue and character development, it was very, very, very good. Next up, we have Season 6, Episode 1, First Time Again, the Season 6 premiere. This episode was interesting. It played with time by having flashbacks, or not really flashbacks, but the kind of periodical events from right after the end of Season 5, leading up to like a week later when they had to deal with this herd problem. And it was really interesting seeing the group come up with these plans and ideas and what they're going to do about this big ass herd in the quarry. And it really was awesome. It was an awesome way to tell this story instead of just going in chronological order, because it would be more of a slow build. But this kind of brought us straight into the action right away, which I thought was really awesome. And a lot of the character development in the flashback sequences were really, really good, with characters like Eugene, Abraham, Sasha, Morgan. They were all getting some pretty good development in those scenes, even Carol. And then we had some of the action-packed scenes going on later on. I also liked Carter, that one dude trying to rise up against Rick. I liked that, and obviously it failed, so interesting stuff. Next up, we have Season 8, Episode 10, The Lost and the Plunderers. This episode was pretty freaking awesome. I liked how they split it up into basically 6 parts, kind of similar to Inmates from Season 4, Episode 10, how they kind of split up the episode into different sections. And we had some really awesome stuff going on in this episode. So, first of all, we got to obviously see the garbage people getting wiped out of the planet, basically. That was awesome. That shocked me, honestly. I didn't expect it to happen. I expected the whole group to last a little longer, but they got wiped out. And then we saw Jadis getting actual good development. I loved her in this episode. And Rick and Michonne obviously still mourning over the death of Carl, which was really sad to see. And they had some pretty good soundtracks and such in this episode as well, which was great. And then Rick and Negan having that conversation on the walkie at the end of the episode was such a good scene. It made for a pretty damn good episode. Next up, we have Season 6, Episode 3, Thank You. And I really did enjoy this episode. It was a really intense and kind of like defeating episode, almost. Like, it just felt like the characters were just defeated by the end of the episode, obviously with the Glenn fake out death, which a lot of people didn't like. I wasn't a big fan of it, but they made it kind of work, sort of, so it didn't really bother me that much in the end. But I definitely enjoyed this episode from a standpoint of it was very action-packed, very intense, very, emotional. It had some really good development for characters like Heath, Michonne, Glenn, Nicholas. Obviously, Nicholas killing himself in the end of the episode anyways, but you get the idea. It had some pretty awesome sequences showing the group on the road. And then, of course, Rick killing those scavengers and the wolves, not scavengers, the wolves in some of the most badass ways possible. That was awesome. So overall, made a pretty good episode, but like I said, the fake out death kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But in the end, like I said, it wasn't that big of a deal. It didn't really make that much of a difference on how much I enjoyed, the season or the episode. Next up, we have Season 7, Episode 4, Service. This episode was a funny, enjoyable, kind of entertaining episode where it was kind of tense in some situations. It was the one, of course, when Negan showed up to Alexandria, and it was a longer 90-minute episode, 90-minute including commercial-type episode, and a lot of people didn't like it. They felt like it dragged on, but honestly, personally, I thought it had a lot of stuff into it, and it really brought Negan, it showed a lot more to Negan that we didn't see before, a lot of his personality, because we saw him obviously being introduced in episode 16 of season 6, and then we saw him in episode 1, and we saw him a little bit in episode 3, but we didn't get to see him in his full personality until this episode, I believe, and that brought some really awesome stuff. And in terms of character building, I mean, the characters were defeated in this episode, man. They felt like they had nothing to do. They felt like they had nothing. They couldn't. They just felt sad and depressing because Negan was taken over basically, and then he was basically telling his own people, "I'm not your leader anymore. Negan is." That was awesome. I liked that episode for those type of scenes, especially a lot of the directing and overall cinematography in this episode was also pretty good. They had a lot of cool shots. But overall, pretty good episode. Next we have Season 8, Episode 1, Mercy. Remember when this episode first came out, it got a lot of hate for certain things, like, Rick not being able to hit Negan, all these other things, a lot of nitpicky type things, and I stuck up for the episode, and I felt bad for it, and after all the season, I didn't like it that much at first. I wasn't part of the nitpick group, I was kind of just part of the small criticism type group, and keeping an open mind and waiting till the season was over. And after the season ended, going back to this episode, it was a lot better than it was the first time watching, I have to say, because it's very fast-paced episode. It's a very different feel than what we're used to, and I think that's why so many people hated it, because it kept going on and on and on. It kept going on, next scene, without many transitions, and it felt like it was too fast. We couldn't keep up, and that was the issue. But after watching the rest of season 8, how fast-paced it was, you were used to it. Rewatching Mercy ended up being a very good episode in terms of, first of all, just some of this directing in this episode is beautiful. Some of the shots they have are beautiful. Some of the overall camera angles, they're very well done. They are. Although the fight scene with the shootout at the sanctuary could have been better, it didn't take away from how well they kind of did it in terms of its overall camera angles and like I said, shots and cinematography. It looked good. I thought it was a good episode in terms of all that, and they were going through with the plan. And like I said, fast paced. You can't hate a fast paced episode. You just can't. Next, we have Season 7, Episode 15, Something They Need. This episode was interesting because Season 7 was one of the kind of slower seasons that we've had, and this episode felt like it was definitely picking up the pace, in relation to previous episodes in the season, especially as the episode before this, Episode 14, was very, very slow. So, seeing this episode was kind of like, holy shit, it's actually starting to pick up pace. And then, obviously, it was a very good setup and a very good lead-in to Episode 16. Few nitpicks, obviously. You're gonna have nitpicks for any episode. I kind of wish they showed Sasha getting actually taken into the sanctuary rather than just skipping that whole thing over and just being like, oh, she got captured, because they left us on a cliffhanger. We were wanting to know what happened with Sasha. We didn't figure it out. We just saw her get captured, or we saw her in the captured state, which was a bit disappointing. And other than that, I liked the stuff with Oceanside. I liked how they were taking Oceanside's guns and bringing Oceanside into a purpose, since it didn't really have that big of a purpose beforehand. So that was great, and I enjoyed the episode for that. Next up, we have Season 5, Episode 15, which is titled Try. This episode was a very awesome story arc that was kind of playing into fold from the comics, which was, of course, the Pete Anderson story arc, with him beating Jesse and Rick wanting to just kick the dude's ass. I really enjoyed the story arc in the comics, and I was really excited to see it play out in the show, and it did not disappoint me at all. I really enjoyed the fight between the two in the end of the episode, and just the build up towards the fight was really awesome to watch. All the scenes with Rick and Jesse and the small clues and hints towards possibly Pete being a douchebag, and I really did enjoy that. Also, we had some stuff with Sasha, Rosita, and Michonne outside the gate. Sasha was going crazy like always, and that obviously led into a big setup for the next episode, which ended up being pretty awesome the next episode. So I gotta say, this episode set up some awesome stuff for sure in a positive way. Next up, we have Season 8, Episode 14, Still Gotta Mean Something. I thought this was a pretty freaking awesome episode. We had a lot of stuff going on with, of course, Rick and Morgan just trying to kill those goddamn saviors, and that was probably the highlight of the episode, I would say. The rest of the episode felt a little, yeah, okay, not amazing, not terrible. I did like stuff with Negan and Jadis, though. We learned a lot more about Negan, why he cares about the bat so much. It's obviously the last piece he has of Lucille, so he cares about the bat. That makes sense. That was cool to see. But Rick and Morgan being I love this scene, the whole sequence. So, first of all, Rick, betraying his trust towards these people because he just doesn't give a shit anymore. That's kind of how we felt this season. And seeing him just kill these men, and then realizing after what the hell they just did, and even Morgan realized what the hell they just did in a later episode. And I love the scene when Rick looks into the mirror, and it's a cracked mirror showing that he's a broken-ass man, like a broken-ass man compared to how he was in the earlier part of the season 8, because he looked in the mirror in the earlier part of season 8. He was still broken, but he wasn't as broken as losing a son is. Losing a son just put him down a path of misery, of despair, and that was beautiful. I loved how that whole scene worked out, and of course we get to see Jared dying, which was also pretty freaking amazing. But yeah, made for a pretty good episode. Next up, we have season 4, episode 11, Claimed. I really enjoyed Claimed. I mean, this was an intense episode, seeing Rick just going through the house and knowing there's other people in there who have guns and will probably kill him if he gets seen, most likely. So he's just being as careful as possible, and then he chokes out that dude in the bathroom. That was a brutal scene. I love that entire episode for just that alone. And then we see awesome stuff going on with Michonne and Carl, them kind of developing the relationship. We get to see Abraham, Rosita, and Eugene in the introduction of those characters, basically, and how they interact with Glenn and Tara, and we get to see some awesome stuff with them as well. So overall, just a pretty good episode. I gotta say, I could never complain about this episode. It's one of those episodes that I can watch tons of times and never get bored of, because it's a very tense episode, I gotta say. It's first time watching was pretty awesome too. Next up, we have season 8, episode 3, which was titled Monsters. This episode was pretty interesting. We had a lot of stuff going on. We had, of course, Rick and Daryl being inside of the building and getting shot, basically almost getting shot out by those dudes. After Daryl, of course, killing Morales, which was interesting how they brought him back. I didn't like how they killed him off. I honestly thought he was going to play a bigger role in the season, but he didn't at all. It was just more of an Easter egg, which I'm okay with as well, but, it would have been cooler to see him actually play some sort of a role in the story and actually be important, but, I digress. And the other parts of the episode were pretty great. We had, of course, Jesus and Morgan fighting, which you can't complain about that. A lot of Kingdom stuff, just the Kingdom group just taking out people one by one. We had the last finishing portions of the battle with Aaron's group at that one outpost, which was pretty awesome to watch. And we also had the, of course, shocking ending of the Kingdomers getting just destroyed by the MG turret, which was also pretty awesome to see. We see Daryl going down the deep end by shooting an innocent dude who was unarmed, and basically showed how Daryl is kind of getting on the deep end of life, we can tell. So, interesting episode. I enjoyed it. Really showed the monster in some of these characters, and I love that, especially in Morgan. Morgan more than anybody, let's be real here. Next up, we have season 3, episode 15, This Sorrowful Life. This episode was, of course, the Merle death episode. I really enjoyed this episode. Seeing Merle kind of... He wanted to do what he didn't think Rick was going to be able to do, which is, of course, take Michonne to Negan. But then he realizes as time goes on, this is not him. This is not something he should be doing. And he's just going to do what he should do, which is go and try to kill Governor on his own, rather than, bring in Michonne and get her killed, which will just show to her brother. It will show to his brother that he is not a loyal person, and he wanted to prove something, even if he was gonna go out dying, and that was awesome. I love that. Of course, we also get to see some great Maggie and Glenn stuff with them getting married. That was cool, and of course the ending, Merle going and just shooting all the people. That was really an intense action sequence, and then what's his name, the governor coming, getting him. I was shocked by this episode. I remember the first time watching it, first day it came out, I was shocked. I did not expect that to happen at all, and he shot him, and I was like, holy shit. Really sad, really emotional, really action-packed episode. I enjoyed it a lot. One of the best of season 3, I have to say. Next is probably one of the more controversial episodes that a lot of people say is a lot worse than this, and that is Season 3, Episode 14, Prey. This episode was the one when Andrea was going off on her own and trying to just get the hell out of Woodbury, and the governor chases her down, and we get to see what I believe is one of the coolest scenes in the Walking Dead history, which is the governor going through that abandoned warehouse and Andrea trying to hide from him, and just slowly, doing his signature whistle, the that freaking that like sinister ass whistle, right? Doing that throughout the place, slowly walking, dragging a shovel across the floor. I mean, it made the governor actually a scary motherfucker, and I love that. And I thought that whole entire 20 minutes of that, which maybe like 15 minutes, was good enough to call it a great episode, in my opinion. I loved that. I absolutely loved that. I know she ended up getting captured anyway, so people thought it was filler. I didn't give a shit if it was filler. I don't, because it was awesome, I gotta say. It did suck not really seeing the main group for the whole episode and it just being Woodbury, but I didn't care. I mean, some of the Milton stuff was cool too. I liked how Milton was starting to change sides, and he ended up burning the walkers, and that obviously pissed the shit out of the governor, and all that was just great. I love this episode more than people do, for the most part. A lot of people tend to hate on it, so yeah, that's how I kind of feel about this episode. In my opinion, it's one of the better ones of Season 3. Next up, we have Season 2, Episode 7, Pretty Much Dead Already. Man, oh man, this episode was great, especially the ending, the last 10 minutes, just seeing Shane just go full-on Shane mode. This is when Shane was, like, leveled up in terms of his just insane, craziness, and he became a much more dangerous person, scaring the shit out of everybody by opening up the barn, and all the walkers coming out, and them shooting them up. And that was great. Also, I love this scene with Shane in the woods with Dale, and he was like, Dale was about to kill Shane with the gun at him, and he was just standing there like, do it, you're soft, you won't. That was great. It was a great Shane episode. Overall, this episode was a Shane episode. It was Shane-centric, let's be real here, 100%. And it made for a pretty freaking great episode. Of course, the reveal of Sophia coming out of the barn was one of the most emotional scenes in the entire Walking Dead history, therefore making it, overall, a great episode. Great mid-season finale for Season 2 as well. Alright, we are now at number 30. That means we are getting into the best episodes of the entire series. I say the rest of the episodes from now are all great to the top 10, which will all be like kind of masterpiece type episodes. But we are now at number 30. This is Season 4, Episode 3, Isolation. This is a very underrated episode. I don't see people usually talking about it, but I really like it. It's one of the parts of the Sickness story arc that I was really entertained by, especially some of the Carl stuff he was going on his own with Herschel. That was pretty awesome to see, but I think the best part of this episode has got to be the end of the episode when Michonne, Daryl, Bob, and Tyrese all run into that huge-ass herd of walkers, and they just have to fight to the death at that point. That was an amazing scene. And just the rest of the stuff in the episode with Tyrese, finding out that Karen and David were killed, and we see Carol. We find out that it was Carol all along, and that was a shock for sure. I did not see that coming at all, and finding that out was quite endearing, and especially for Tyrese, seeing him just go off on Rick in the beginning of the episode, and then Rick fights back. A very, very emotional and sort of tense episode that I really thought was a good one, and I don't really see people talk about it that much. Next we have Season 5, Episode 11, The Distance. This is the episode after Aaron was introduced, and this episode was really awesome for non-comic book fans. Obviously, I'm not a non-comic book fan, so, it was still a great episode, not gonna lie, but for non-comic book fans, it kind of felt like you were just so curious as to what this community is going to be like, because you had no idea. You didn't know if it was going to be safe or not. Of course, comic book readers, we all knew it was going to be safe, but it was still intense to see these characters kind of realizing maybe it is a safe place, especially characters like Michonne thinking we have to try this place out, even if it's bad, it's worth a shot, and that's what they were all believing. But after seeing Terminus, and it's what made Terminus such an important community and such an important story arc, because it made this doubt of Alexandria so much more prevalent, and that was probably what made this episode so good for me. And they had some really intense scenes, especially when they're driving through that herd of walkers on the street, and then Glenn gets lost in the woods, and they see Aaron's loyalty throughout the episode, especially towards the ending when they realize, he's just a normal guy. He's just a normal guy who's just looking out for his people, and he cares about them, and he wants more people to join the community. Next up, we have Season 7, Episode 7, Sing Me a Song. This episode was after a bunch of slow kind of bottle episodes. I wouldn't call them filler, but, after a bunch of slow sort of episodes that only really, focused on certain groups. This episode was a huge change of pace because we got to see a lot more groups, a lot more communities in one episode, and brought to life one of my favorite parts of the entire comic book to life, which was, of course, Carl barging into the sanctuary and having some awesome scenes with Negan, and man, did they deliver. The whole introduction of the sanctuary in episode 3 wasn't anywhere nearly as good as how they introduced it in this episode, how they built upon it, and this was the real introduction of the sanctuary that I wanted. It felt like a bigger community, it felt like it was actually a place, and that it actually was scary, sort of. It gave us more of an idea as to what the sanctuary was, as what it was like in the comics, and it felt so good to see this episode, especially after being a comic book reader, and I loved it. I loved every second of it. I think it was one of the episodes where I actually thought Chandler Rings did an amazing job, because look, I've said bad stuff about the actor in the past. Some of his episodes were kind of meh, but this episode, I think he killed it, and he definitely killed it in some other episodes later in season 8 as well. I think as time went on, he grew as an actor and actually decided to start doing some pretty good jobs, here and there. But for some parts, he was also, in my opinion, not the greatest. We also had some really cool Jesus stuff, just Jesus doing Jesus stuff. I don't know, he was cool in this episode. He was only in a little bit of it, but when he was in it, it was pretty damn awesome. So I enjoyed it. Next up, we have Season 5, Episode 14, Spend. This episode was pretty intense. It had some really awesome scenes at the factory with Glenn, Noah, Tara, Eugene, and all of them trying to go on a run to get some stuff that Eugene needed to build certain things in Alexandria, and some pretty awesome stuff went down. I mean, this was an episode that really made walkers a major threat, and of course we saw the death of Aiden and Noah, and Noah's death was one of the goriest, insane, crazy deaths we've ever had in the Walking Dead history. I mean, seeing his cheek ripped out was just so brutal, and I loved how it was done with the whole revolving door thingy and how they got stuck in it. I thought that was brilliantly done, and it really made for an intense sequence. It made us really hate Nicholas, which is definitely warranted. And we also had, of course, the Carol's realization that Pete is an abusive husband, and that slowly was revolving over the episode. And then, of course, she tells Rick at the end, "You're gonna have to kill the motherfucker," which I thought was such a beautifully done scene, and the whole episode I think was just a really well done episode that doesn't really get as much credit as it deserves. Next up, we have Season 6, Episode 8, Start to Finish. This is when No Way Out started to come into play. Of course, it was kind of like a two-part episode, it felt like. Of course, I believe the next one, of course, was a lot better, which will be later on the list, you'll see. But this part was definitely a good mid-season finale, I thought. But I did have some issues with it when it first came out. I was kind of pissed that they didn't show, that they didn't end it with Carl getting his eye shot out and all that. But since we got to see that in the next episode, honestly, it made this episode seem a lot more important and impactful than I previously thought. It was an intense, action-packed type episode, especially the first 10 minutes of everyone just running the hell away from the walkers and being scared out of their minds and hiding inside their houses for a long-ass time and just being scared out of their mind. I thought it was beautifully done. How the music was played during the beginning sequence with the turnips, whatever, the tulip song, whatever it was called, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. I thought that was a well done kind of how they played with that, and they made Sam seem like he was just going absolutely insane. And of course, Deanna's final ending, and the last 5 minutes of the episode was just wow. That was incredible. Just the music, just them walking outside of the house. It was such a beautifully done scene, and I personally, one of my favorite scenes in the entire Walking Dead history.